Boston Massacre. As tension mounted in the colonies over steep taxation, the British sent additional troops to Boston. There had been British troops in North America off and on since the French and Indian War. They were supposed to be there to keep peace with the Indians. But instead of keeping peace, their presence stirred up hostilities among the colonists. Scuffles went back and forth pretty regularly between soldiers doing their job and colonists picking on them. Stones were thrown, snowballs were hurled, and insults flew. On March 5, 1770, one such scuffle grew into a deadly brawl. Shots from British soldiers were fired into a rowdy crowd. When the smoke cleared away, 3 colonists lay dead in the snow. 2 more were wounded and died soon after. The sad event has been remembered as the Boston Massacre. This strong term would make you think that a large number of people died, but that's not the case. The term indicates just how upset the colonists were with the British and would serve as a clue that war was on its way. Boston Tea Party. Now, do you remember the Townshend Acts that placed a tax on British goods going into the American colonies? Well, because of all the complaints and boycotts, most of the Townshend Acts were repealed in 1770. But the tax on tea remained. This led to one of the most memorable events of the American Revolution. We call it the Boston Tea Party. Here's the story. Colonial merchants who boycotted British tea were smuggling it in from other countries, like the Netherlands, to sell to their fellow colonists. One such smuggler was John Hancock, known later for his oversized signature on the Declaration of Independence. When the British realized that the colonial merchants were buying tea from somewhere other than England, they removed an import tax on British tea going into America and allowed British merchants to sell directly to their own agents in the colonies at half the price. Colonial merchants were outraged over this British monopoly of tea. One of those speaking out against the injustice was Samuel Adams, a Puritan who organized the Boston Sons of Liberty, an underground freedom-fighting group of rebels. As an act of defiance, about 150 colonists, including Samuel Adams, dressed up like Native Americans, war paint and all, and boarded British tea ships anchored in Boston Harbor. Through the night of December 16, 1773, the angry colonists, in costume with Indian axes, hacked open 342 cases of British tea and dumped 90,000 pounds of it into the cold waters of the harbor. That was nearly $2 million worth of tea, according to today's prices. Unfortunately for the colonists, this bold prank backfired and proved to worsen the situation. To make an example of the Bostonians, the British Parliament punished them in 1774 by passing the Intolerable Acts. Scary name, don't you think? As part of the Intolerable Acts, the Boston Harbor was closed to all trade and business. That wasn't good for anyone on either side of the Atlantic. Paul Revere's Ride. Back in Boston, the colonists were keeping a close eye on the British Army, and the British Army had a close eye on the colonists. Remember, British troops had been present in the colonies since the French and Indian War. Well, the British troops discovered that colonists were stashing gunpowder in Concord, a Massachusetts town not far from Boston. This news was shared with General Thomas Gage, a British officer who had previously served alongside George Washington in the French and Indian War. It was the duty of General Gage to stop the storing up of gunpowder and disarm the colonists. He did so by organizing a British attack on Concord. The British were also out to arrest John Hancock and Samuel Adams for their involvement in the Boston Tea Party. Hancock and Adams were at that time in the town of Lexington, just miles from Concord. They were in big trouble as the British were headed their way. The watchful eye of Dr. Joseph Warren, one of the Sons of Liberty, saw the British attack coming. On April 18, 1775, he called for 2 swift riders to get word out to the colonists that the British were advancing. Those writers were William Dawes and the ever-famous Paul Revere. Dawes stole behind British lines going one direction, and Paul Revere went the other. To reach Hancock and Adams in Lexington, Paul Revere was taken by boat across the Charles River, given a horse on the other side, and sent galloping off in the dark of the night. According to legend, Paul Revere supposedly knew what message to spread because of signal lanterns placed in the steeple of the Old North Church in Boston. Though historians are not sure if Revere ever saw these signals, or if he was even the one for whom they were intended, one lantern in the church tower would mean the British were coming by land. 2 lanterns would mean they were coming by sea. As it turned out, 2 lanterns shone from the church steeple that night, but only for a brief time, so as not to alert the British. The lanterns effectively warned colonists in areas close to Boston that the British were on the move, while Revere and Dawes rode through the countryside with the message. Though folklore spreads the tale, Paul Revere never rode through the streets yelling, "The British are coming." Did Paul Revere warn the colonists of the British invasion in time to make a difference? Yes and no. He arrived in Lexington early enough to sneak Hancock and Adams out of harm's way. But while en route from Lexington to Concord, Revere, Dawes, and a third rider were captured by the British. Dawes and the new rider escaped. Revere was detained and later released. Though not completely accurate, the classic poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, titled Paul Revere's Ride, famously commemorates this historic event. Battles of Lexington and Concord. Despite the advance warnings to colonists by Dawes and Revere, the British continued their advance. In the dead of night, colonial militia lined up to face British troops in Lexington, Massachusetts. And then it happened. On April 19, 1775, a single shot was fired to officially start the American Revolution. Though no one knows which side fired that first shot, the battles that followed would have ripple effects around the world. The War of Independence had begun, and a new nation would take its first breath. Several men from both sides of the conflict died that first night of the war, and the fighting carried on from Lexington to Concord.
Later that morning, Mary watched the column of British soldiers pass her home on their way to Concord.
In Concord, the British had a hard time finding the stash of gunpowder they were supposed to retrieve. Apparently, the colonists had spent all night hiding it. Nonetheless, fighting broke out when it appeared that some houses in the town had been set on fire. Colonial militia seemed to spring up from everywhere. The British received fresh troops as well, but still suffered a high number of casualties. In fact, the British lost twice as many as the colonists in those first 2 battles. They retreated to Boston to tend to their wounds, but there in the big city, more colonial militia encircled them. Colonial defeat at the Battle of Bunker Hill. Just north of Boston lies a small peninsula. This peninsula has 2 hills, Bunker Hill and Breed's Hill. It was obvious that if the colonists could place cannons on those hills, which overlook Boston, they would have the British in the palms of their hands. So on the night of June 16, 1775, about 1,200 colonial militiamen scrambled, climbed, and carried cannons to the tops of these 2 hills. As morning light of June 17th dawned, the British could see these cannons with their own eyes. A hot defensive battle followed. British troops were led by General William Howe. Colonial troops were led and inspired by General Israel Putnam and Colonel William Prescott. The worn-down colonists were tired from having stayed up all night moving those cannons. They were also low on ammunition and resorted to melting down pipe organs for bullets. Still, from their hilltop advantage, they had the edge over the British, whom they proceeded to fire on through the day. The British lost men right and left, but they continued to press down on the colonists. They had one weapon in their favor. The British had bayonet rifles, which are guns with built-in swords. So, when the colonists ran out of firing power, The British, in their bright red uniforms, advanced with their sharp bayonets for face-to-face combat. The colonists were forced to retreat, and the British claimed victory at Bunker Hill. Though most of the battle was fought on Breed's Hill, Bunker Hill became the more famous of the two. The British were inspired by their victory at Bunker Hill, and yet humbled by their many losses. They never expected the ragtag militia of colonists to fight as bravely as they did.